Aloha. My name is Marissa Machida, President of Napaba Hawaii and also with Bank of Hawaii. Thank you for joining us in part 2 of a 2-part panel discussion featuring leaders from all sectors of our community on a conversation on race in Hawaii, history and current issues, and the future. We must respond. We hope these conversations will be insightful, educational, and inspirational, and are grateful for the support of many organizations. I'll go through them quickly for those of you just listening in. Mahalo to our event sponsors, Japanese American Citizens League of Honolulu, National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, Hawaii, the ACLU of Hawaii, the Popolo Project, William S. Richardson School of Law, the Muslim Association of Hawaii, We Are Oceania, Anthology Group, and Bank of Hawaii. Mahalo also to our community sponsors and supporters, the Korean American Bar Association, Pacific Islander Law Association, African American Lawyers Association, Beta Beta Gamma Foundation, Hawaii Friends of Civil Rights, Shining Islam's Light Across Humanity, Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii, the Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution, Honolulu, Hawaii NAACP, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, Nisei Veterans Legacy, Vai Vai Collective, Hawaii Health and Harm Reduction Center, Hawaii Innocence Project, Native Hawaiian Bar Association, Hawaii Filipino Lawyers Association, and also the Hawaii State Bar Association, Diversity, Equity, and Access to the Law Committee. As moderator for both panels, we are honored to have Noelani Kalipi. Noelani, I'll turn it over to you.
Aloha and welcome to our discussion tonight. I am very honored to be your moderator. We appreciate how personal this topic is for so many of us. In Hawaii, we pride ourselves in our ability to get along and we strive for harmony. Racism, on the other hand, manifests superiority, inferiority, and exclusion. And what makes it even more challenging is how some of these practices are so deeply ingrained into the way it is in Hawaii that many of us fail to even recognize how we are enabling or contributing to systemic racism in Hawaii. And when it's pointed out to us, the harmony is then put at risk. And this is part of why it's so uncomfortable to talk about the topic. The intention of the 2 sessions that we are having in this series is to begin to make it okay to talk about racism in Hawaii. Let's stop pretending it isn't there. Tonight, we are joined by an expert panel representing many of the organizations and sectors that are addressing the continuum of systemic racism in Hawaii. Our panel includes Camille Nelson, Dean, UH William S. Richardson School of Law, Dr. Akemi Glenn, the Popolo Project, Michelle Kauhane, Hawaii Community Foundation, Justin Kolar, County of Kauai, Office of the Prosecuting Attorney, and Patrick McGurk, Bank of Hawaii. As we learned during our first panel discussion, time is going to fly by tonight, and there will be points in the discussion where we're all a little bit uncomfortable, and that's okay. Let's lean into that discomfort. Let's marinate in that discomfort together so that we can open our eyes, ears, hearts, and minds to really see what people are experiencing, to really hear what they are saying, and to maybe even share in what they are feeling. What actions can we be inspired to take as a result? Okay, let's get started. Our first question tonight for each of our panelists is going to be, can you identify an issue that you or your organization is working on to address racism in Hawaii? And as you answer that, can you please provide the context of the situation and what actions you are taking to address it? Let's get started with Michelle Kauhane from the Hawaii Community Foundation.
Thank you, Noi, and thank you all for the opportunity to discuss this topic. I will start by saying for the Hawaii Community Foundation, prior to the pandemic, just a few years ahead of that, we launched what we call the Change Framework. And change is really a framework by which we look at each sector in our community economy, health, arts, etc. Across the framework, looking at data to identify where there are challenges and opportunities for investment in our community. Data was our starting point through an equity journey that helped to highlight where there were disparities, where we see income and wealth disparities, where we see disparities in levels where power sits. And so it really was the starting point and a framework by which we could dig deeper into looking at data around health, housing, economic development, etc. And then once we disaggregate the data, then we see who in community is being impacted and by what. And as you mentioned earlier, Noi, the topic of racism has been difficult in Hawaii, but as we look through the data, once we start cross-cutting data with who is being impacted by homeownership rates, who is being impacted by incarceration rates, who is making up the population of our homeless here in Hawaii, then we start to see that race becomes a factor, that there are some disparities across race, socioeconomic status, et cetera. So for us, the journey started really, and we're on through the Change Framework. It then allows us to say we want to contribute resources to where we see the greatest need. How do we take the resources and how does philanthropy help support where these big disparities and gaps are so that we're ensuring we're doing programming and working with nonprofits on the ground to address the needs where they are the highest. And then last, we don't just want to talk about this here at home because systemic racism is a global issue. And so we've taken our efforts not just here at home, but we're also collaborating with other community foundations. There are a group of community foundations across the country that are digging deeper and exploring this issue together. That what role do we have as philanthropy, as community foundations who are uniquely positioned to forge connection, to keep people at the table and to work cross-sector? How do we have this conversation with other community foundations nationally on how we each bring the conversation to the forefront? So the Change Framework, we're using that as the basis. We ground that in equity, and we're having those conversations here locally and then across the country with other like-minded organizations and community foundations across the country.
Thank you, Michelle. We're gonna now ask Justin. Can you address the question?
Yeah, aloha, thank you. And that is a very important question. One thing we know about the criminal legal system in Hawaii is that it disproportionately impacts marginalized communities, Native Hawaiian communities, Pacific Islander communities, communities of color, economically disadvantaged communities. So what we do is look at ways of lessening that impact. And one important way that we found is, we look at where the cases happen, and the vast majority of criminal cases in Hawaii happen in the district courts. Traffic cases, misdemeanor cases, driving without license, failures to appear, things like that, where a person will maybe get in trouble for driving without insurance or without a driver's license and end up going to court, getting a conviction for that, racking up fines and fees that they're unable to pay, or maybe they miss a court date, so a stopper gets put on their license, and they find themselves in this cycle that it's extremely difficult to break out of. When they keep getting arrested for contempt, they get out, they get a court date, they have multiple court dates. It's difficult to keep track of everything. Even if everything in your life is going well, much less if you're disadvantaged by not having a home, not having a way to get around, not having transportation or access to any support. So we've enacted a lot of policies in our office that are directly aimed at reducing or eliminating those prosecutions, objecting to the imposition of driver's license stoppers. A driver's license stopper is entirely disconnected from your ability to safely operate a motor vehicle. That's why you have a driver's license. Your driver's license is not connected to your duty to appear in court, your duty to pay fines and fees, your duties to pay child support, whatever the case may be. The fact is, in Hawaii, people need driver's licenses to be able to get around. So by looking at the ways that the system can kind of grind and crush disadvantaged people into perpetual subservience or second-class citizenry, we feel is a way that can benefit and lift people up rather than simply perpetuating the same old bureaucratic machine that's existed for decades in Hawaii. So, by creating presumptions against seeking sentencing enhancements, you can go to jail for an entire year for driving without a license in Hawaii. And I've seen it happen, unfortunately. Something that is very far removed from any notion of public safety or public protection. So we've eliminated to the greatest extent possible that type of thing from happening in our district courts here in the Fifth Circuit on Kauai. And I would call on certainly police and prosecutors in other circuits to look at those things as well. Our job should be to protect the community, to keep the community safe, and not to effectively be a boot on the neck of people who are trying to work, trying to get by, trying to feed themselves, trying to feed their families. But we still have a long way to go. We do exist in a system that is subject to systemic racism, that perpetuates systemic racism, contrary to what you will hear people say in some of the other counties. It very much exists. It is very real, and it is here in Hawaii. Is it the same flavor and brand as what we see on the continent? Maybe not necessarily, but that does not mean it is any less real. So there is a lot that we can do within our system, our closed universe of the criminal legal system, that can really reduce that harm and actually help people to be able to go about their lives while also making sure we have a safe community.
Thank you. Wow, that's a lot. Thank you very much for sharing that. I'm sure we'll get lots of questions too. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Akemi Glenn.
Mahalo. Thank you for the chance to share a little bit about our work at the Popolo Project and to be a part of this important conversation this evening. So our work is certainly very focused on race, but I think coming from a different angle. We're not necessarily a civil rights organization at the Popolo Project, but we're interested in creating space for our community to be visible and for our community to be able to represent ourselves on our own terms. I'm sure many people on the call tonight know that people of African descent or people who are identified as Black here in Hawaii are less than 4% of the total population. And while we are small numbers, we're relatively visible as a community. And so when we talk about what Hawaii looks like or what people expect locals to look like, it's often not a face like mine. And though there are Black folks who have been here for many generations, in some cases more than 100 years living on these islands, we're really interested in opening up space for us as an entire community to reflect on what it means to belong here. And we do that in our programming through offering educational opportunities, cultural opportunities for us to gather and represent and understand the diversity of Black culture here in Hawaii. And also think about what it means that we're here. So some of us are descendants of people who were enslaved in North America and have a very visceral connection to the experiences of racialized violence there. And though we're living in Hawaii and physically removed from that, psychically and spiritually, we're certainly connected to that legacy. And because of that history and because of that experience, we often talk about our Black community here in Hawaii as locally rooted and globally connected. And similar to Michelle's comment a few minutes ago, when we talk about race, we have to situate it as a global phenomenon. And though Hawaii has a very specific history, it's not unique in the ways that race has come here and structured our society in the last 125 years or so. So in our programming, we offer spaces for families who are Black families and families with Black children to connect with each other, to really reaffirm our humanity. But we also have formal programs like our Understanding Race and Belonging curriculum that we have shared across the community, where we actually take the time to delve into some of the history and look at some of the data and think about how people are actually impacted by race. And I think there is a discourse here in Hawaii where we say that we don't necessarily talk about race here, but I think that really depends on who you're talking to. Many of us talk about race a lot because it impacts us directly. And so we try to open up a space through our Understanding Race and Belonging curriculum, which we've offered across the community, for us to have a shared vocabulary, because I think we are having these conversations, but not necessarily together. And we're interested in seeing what kind of vocabulary we can articulate together that actually reflects our experience here in Hawaii. And as I'm sure all of us here in the Zoom box today, you know, we understand that Hawaii is different from North America. And a lot of the ways that we talk about race are very framed around a binary of Black and white. We don't have that here. We have incredible diversity in Hawaii, but it's also really important in our work to underscore the fact that diversity is actually precondition for hierarchy, right? So you need to have different kinds of people that we can recognize to be able to order them. So diversity is not enough to say that there's no hierarchy or there's not power imbalances. And we really work hard to engage with other community organizations to help articulate a way for us to talk about this that's meaningful and transformative. Mahalo.
Thank you. Again, I think that'll generate a lot more questions. Next, we'll hear from Dean Nelson.
Thank you. It's great to be here with you. And I just want to recognize and share my appreciation with the organizers and for the sponsors. Also, I really commend the remarks already shared from my co-panelists, and I think they're on point and brilliant. One of the things that I want to share with you in terms of an intervention, as it were, that we are working on presently at the William S. Richardson School of Law is a leadership lab, an island leadership lab is I think the title we're going to settle on. And I want to back into why, when I think about that and the origin of that as an initiative, stems from the last 20 years or so of me being an academic and teaching, contracts, torts, crim law, crim pro, legal profession, critical race theory, sports law, health law, and a number of classes that just sort of span the curriculum. And in each and every one of these encounters with absolutely wonderful students in multiple states, I've experienced a sense of disempowerment from so many students, even in law school, and especially from women and people of color and people from non-traditional, in quotes, legal background. And I've been thinking more and more about that because these are educated people who are brilliant and have, so much to offer, and yet still within the context of law schools even, they don't see the brightness of their own possibilities. And I think that is not surprising, especially when we're speaking about people coming from marginalized communities and underserved communities. And when I think about diversity and inclusion, it leads me to beg the question and ask the question, to what end? And I think the end is empowerment. And I think the empowerment is to speak to what Akemi and Michelle have mentioned, the fact that disparity sits right where power rests, right? So wherever there is power, there is disparity. And I would add, wherever there is power, there is discretion that is not usually exercised in favor of marginalized communities and underserved communities. And similarly, within communities, there are hierarchies that perpetuate prejudice and discrimination and exclusion. And so when we think about leadership, multi-sector leadership, right? Lawyers go out and they're in every sector. And so that's my space as an educator in a law school. But I recognize that law graduates go out and they impact and they inform every sector. And I really want for us as a state that celebrates diversity and a school that's been heralded as a diverse and inclusive school to see ourselves as supporting the next generation of leaders, diverse leaders, inclusive leaders, courageous leaders, leaders with great IQ, leaders with great EQ, leaders who want to make a difference for the greater good. And to start that conversation earlier than when you are in practice or when you are in a sector where you have the discretion now, right? So I want people, one, to recognize and for us to support them and recognize their own leadership capacity and to offer and support them in the skills and the mindset. And we've been fortunate that the Hawaii Leadership Forum has been our first sponsor and supporter in this initiative. And so we're incredibly grateful, and we're going to be joined by a number of the Aminiar Fellows and a number of other people, and we'll splash that and share that more in the coming weeks and months. But that's how I'm coming to that, right? Is to say to people, especially people who are not traditionally seen as leaders, is your voice matters. And we are here to support you in making sure that your voice activates catalytic change for the good. And so how can we be helpful now in law school to make sure that you are able to achieve those ends? So that's a part of why we have that lab that will be forthcoming in the fall term. And that's part of the background context that I hope adds to the diversity, inclusion, and empowerment part of this possibility.
That makes me definitely want to go back to school. Okay, and we're gonna now we're gonna hear from Patrick, who's gonna share with us how Bank of Hawaii is addressing this.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks to all the sponsors for having me. And all I can say too is Dean Nelson signed me up, right? Following that, I'm all in. That was terrific, and as were the rest of the speakers. I too am a lawyer and also a banker, and I think about racism and what I can do with it through that corporate lens. So it shouldn't be a surprise that my perspective is that as much or more than government or advocacy or charitable groups, corporations like mine are uniquely situated to drive the kind of needed social change we're talking about here. I had a lot of great stuff about why corporations are best suited and what the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion is. But let's just assume those two things, and we'll skip right to discussing what might be a practical corporate framework for addressing historical racial inequities. The how, right? I would propose a three-pronged corporate approach. The first prong is the company's strategy and tactics for attracting, retaining, and developing diverse talent. The second prong is how can the company project its influence into the broader business communities in which it operates in order to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then third, how can the company weave its business strategy into a broader social agenda designed to address issues of inequality in the community at large? Here's what I mean on the first prong: attracting, retaining, developing talent, is that DE&I must be an intentional part of the company's strategy. The tone from the top is critical. The message needs to be set goals, measure results, incentivize executives based on whether or not they are delivering on those goals. There must be a person at your company responsible and accountable for a corporation's programmatic DE&I efforts. A director of diversity, corporate responsibility, environmental social governance, call it what you will. But there has to be someone in charge of the strategy, and that someone has to be directly accountable to the CEO. Next, your human resources department must be a true strategic partner to the business. Understanding that no slate of candidates is complete unless diverse candidates are presented for consideration. It's more work, it takes longer, but it's worth it. And once those candidates become employees, we must create a safe space for self-expression among our employees. You know, as Noe mentioned previously, it has to be okay to have conversations about race. And oh, by the way, gender and sexual orientation, and everything else, both within your company's walls and in response to macro social justice issues, right? Employee resource groups are a great place to start creating those necessary bubbles of psychological safety that really allow diverse employees to thrive. Now, that foundation for trust among management and diverse employees creates an environment that allows people to bring their whole true selves to work and understand that their voices are being heard and that they can climb the corporate ladder, become leaders despite their differences. It's also a great foundation for another essential tactic, mentoring. If you are not being intentional about mentoring in your corporation, especially diverse employees, you're missing an opportunity to deliver on equity and inclusion. So the second prong is, using influence with your business partners. Now, I'm a big believer in the power of the corporate purse to promote change, like through supplier diversity, right? Corporations use a lot of vendors, and we can decide how we want to spend our money. We can choose to encourage or demand that to get our business, vendors must be diverse, promote diversity, or at least seek to mentor and bring along diverse younger people so that they can become next generation of business leaders. They can become the next generation of business owners. And finally, the third prong, let's consider a case study for where a business need intersects with DE&I strategy and the community at large. By looking, as was mentioned previously, at the rise in sort of the vagrant population, vagrant-related violence in downtown Honolulu. It's obvious that homelessness disproportionately impacts communities of color. It's a diversity issue. We want our employees and customers to feel safer in and around our buildings downtown. So what can we do? Here's a plan. Increase guard patrols, increase lighting, increase video surveillance, other technology, coordinate with local businesses to improve community policing and information sharing, and your ability to encourage the police and prosecutors and politicians to focus on the issue. But then we can go deeper. We can direct corporate philanthropy to the issue of homelessness. And we can ensure that our executives are serving on the boards of charities that assist the homeless and therefore have a voice in setting the strategy of those organizations and therefore affect real change. If that's effective, then you're helping to create new customers, new employees, new productive members of society. And that's what I call like a vertically integrated strategy for addressing a business issue, which is also a societal issue, which is also ultimately a race issue. And that one's not just a hypothetical. That is the current strategy of Bank of Hawaii is executing to address that issue in downtown Honolulu. So that's kind of only scratching the surface. There's some low-hanging fruit there, some longer-term strategies, but in the end, hopefully a few ideas that can give everybody a little bit of food for thought. There's a ton of progress we can make on these issues if we all put our noses to the grindstone. I very much look forward to continuing that work and this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. We are getting a number of questions coming in through our Q&A. So I want to share that we probably are not going to get through all of them if our history with the last panel serves us right, but we do want to be able to jump into some of those questions so that this is a dialogue that's in real time. So one of the questions is to Michelle. asking, can you give a detailed and direct example of what some of the interventions against racism look like that the Change Framework has identified?
So Noy, again, I will, to the question, the Change Framework really helps us to identify where disparities exist. So a specific example, if we look at the zip codes on West Oahu and the zip codes on East Oahu, we know that the data shows us that there is almost a 10-year difference in life expectancy. So when we start to disaggregate the data and say who's living in West Oahu, we learn that it's one of the highest concentrated populations of Native Hawaiians. And so there are health disparities. So we know we need to put resources in that specific area. And that a system that has not made as much investment into that part of the island, into that zip code, whether that's roads, water, sewer, infrastructure, has a direct impact on the health outcomes of those people. So that's part of the system. And so investing resources where we see those kinds of disparities is one way that we might use the Change Framework. Another quick example would be on COFA migrants. We know that COFA migrants have had inequitable access to healthcare. And so we are intentionally doing grant programs that support nonprofits on the ground who have reach into those communities to help them get enrolled. There's a new law that allows them now to re-enroll and to have Medicaid. And so we will invest resources to get into those communities and dig deep to make sure that they have better access. So again, data is the grounding force that allows us to decide where we should be putting resources. And it's a starting point, right? We have to get deeper. We have to have harder conversations. We have to do more disaggregation of data. But the framework has set us on a foundation to use data to start the difficult conversations and to help us identify how do we work with our donors and with philanthropists to not just share and help to do giving in the things that they care about, but helping to help donors realize where the greatest needs are in the community so we can facilitate giving into where Hawaii's greatest challenges are. And that's really the premise behind the framework.
Thank you. We have another question for Dean Nelson. In one of the references, speaking about disparity sits where power resides. And this person has a question about, does power reside in the Hawaii Asian American community? And please elaborate if you can.
Sure, and there's another question I believe about, are there emerging leaders in various spaces that perhaps people don't conceptualize as power bases? And the answer to that is clearly yes. And that's sort of the point of what we're trying to do, because talent is equally dispersed, but opportunity is not. And so we're trying to give greater opportunities for people from whatever their background is and walk of life, and whether they've been anointed as a leader, to go forward and recognize that they have a role to play in shaping society. And as to the question you started with, Noe, you know, I think so. I mean, I think one, and it, you know, and this is where we have to start, in my humble estimation, with self. I can both be discriminated against and discriminate against others, for example, right? In my flexing of my power and my use of my discretion, and in my day-to-day choices that I make, I can also, you know, I can be hurt and I can harm others. So I don't think there's any place or any space or any people who are immune from anything that we're talking about, even recognizing at the same time the heinous violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders that we've witnessed, right? And then we have to, though, continue to think, how do we make sure that doesn't happen here or elsewhere ever again? And how do we support those families and people in those affected communities? but how also do we make sure that we aren't impacting others in any negative way, but are rather trying to be positive influences and supporting across race and ethnicity and ability and sexuality and class. I mean, it's the intersection of all that we are, because we're also not just one thing, right? Right, we are a multiplicity of identities at any given time walking through a really complicated world. And so how do we navigate and try to do our best by ourselves, for ourselves, but importantly for others who we think are not like us as well. At the end of the day, I think, we're more similar than we are dissimilar, but we have to take the time and put the energy and investment in ascertaining those points of affinity so we can respect each other.
Definitely, and that brings up a discussion point I think we may have also touched upon in the previous panel, where we were talking about, the question, and I posed this to the whole panel, are the inequities and experiences that we're discussing focused, more on race and ethnicity or power and access? Or is it a combination of both? And what, in the work that you're doing, what are some of the inherent biases you guys are seeing in the system? Dr. Glenn, would you be willing to answer that?
Sure. I want to take just a minute and hit this beat. We often talk about the system, and I think almost everyone on this panel is also a lawyer, a legal scholar. And I think one of the things we have to do is contextualize what we mean when we say the system. Certainly we're talking about institutions, but we're also talking about the cultures and the values that create those institutions. And so I think your question, Noe, about, are we talking about race and ethnicity, or are we talking about power and access? There's no way to talk about those things in the society and the culture that we live in right now as discrete. Those things are imbued with each other, and they shape in ways that are really difficult for us to get to. One of the challenges when we talk about culture, and that's my scholarly background, is investigating how culture is formed and how culture changes over time, is that we often can't talk about what culture is actually doing. We live in it, we stew in it every day, we transmit it to our children, we inherited it from our grandparents, but it's hard to know exactly what those mechanisms are. And I think that's the real crux of the challenge for us right now. Certainly when we look at systems, and when we're talking about race and power, and when we're talking about profitability, and we're talking about value, these different lines of understanding of the value of humans and land and our connections to each other come into kind of clashing interactions. And I think one of the challenges as of this conversation is being able to be honest about the ways that racism is embedded in a cultural system that has deemed people at different times in different places as valuable, as worthy of listening to, as possible leaders, as possible experts or not. And I think that that's why we keep circling around some of these issues, because we're dancing around a really disparate set of values that we don't necessarily all share. And, as the questioner is asking about leaders emerging in places like Pololo or Kalihi or Waianae, I think that question signals that we already know how power is arrayed. We're very familiar with it in our community. And, asking these questions is an important first step, but I think many of us already operate and comport ourselves because we understand how these systems interact and what some of the most challenging aspects of those systems are.
Thank you. Along those lines, Justin, would you like to comment on that in terms of the inherent biases that you're seeing? And there's also a question from someone in the chat talking about how individuals can also help affect the changes in the areas that you identified, and that these changes require people to know and understand their neighbors so that they can treat them more fairly rather than vilifying them. Do you have a take on that?
I do have a take on that. And one example that I've been meditating on today, a very specific example. Yesterday, I spent a large part of my day dealing with responding to media inquiries concerning a woman who touched a monk seal on our island over here. And how the media responds to that situation versus how it responds to other situations. Because normally in Hawaii, when someone is arrested and charged with a crime, you know, and the majority of the folks arrested and charged with crimes in Hawaii are people of color, the person's mugshot and full name are blasted out in the media along with a list of sinister sounding charges of which they have been accused of. Yet in the coverage of this individual who touched the seal, I saw several media outlets, including local Hawaii media outlets, say they identified her by her first name, but did not use her last name out of respect for her privacy. And so, you know, I found that very, and her last name is known. We know what her last name is. And so to me, that is an example of, you know, an unmistakable bias that is just baked into how we think about race and crime in Hawaii. And, you know, we need to do better. As to the question in the chat, how can we help affect the changes in the areas I identified? To know and understand your neighbors. Well, yeah, I mean, knowing and understanding your neighbors is part one. And we are very lucky to live in a place where we actually have the chance to know a lot of our neighbors here in Hawaii. But also to understand the narratives that exist around race and crime in Hawaii, and to be able to read between the lines of those narratives as they are perpetuated, not just in the media. I mean, we have media outlets in Hawaii that do a good job talking about crime. We have media outlets that do a terrible job talking about crime. But especially in these incredibly toxic social media groups that are devoted exclusively to how to say it, to bashing people who have been accused of crimes, and pushing the narratives that, you know, they're animals, they're terrible people, they don't belong here, they're all guilty, you know, back the blue, this and that, just contributes to an incredibly toxic rhetoric around the issue of crime and race in Hawaii. So being able to see through those narratives, being able to see through, you know, reporting that is simply regurgitated press releases that come from law enforcement entities, to be able to think through, you know, how would I want my family member to be treated in this situation if they were to be accused of doing what this person is doing? To have empathy and basic human decency. You know, so many people here are, you know, we all know somebody who's been through the system. So, and we know what that person went through trying to either just survive that experience and get their life back on track. You know, being able to keep that empathy and that humanity in mind, and recognize that we all do live on these small islands here in the middle of the ocean. So, you know, so we can treat them more fairly rather than vilify them. Yes, I think that has to be a conscious decision that we make as citizens and as residents, that we are going to treat our neighbors and our family members and our extended ohana as humans and who are more than their worst day. So to me, that's a big part of it.
There are some great quotes coming out. Michelle, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I'm just like scrolling through the questions because I see lots of them coming through, and I just have a general comment because to Patrick's questions about how do we know it works, and you know, what is, you know, how do we know it works? We don't, but we're all trying to contribute to a better system. And so as Dr. Akemi Glenn spoke about the system, let's be clear about what the system is. We're talking about institutional discrimination, right? Institutions and organizations, and we're talking about fixing systems, making systems change. But I think we all are at a point where we are looking at historical context. We're looking at how did we get here? We're looking at data to see what disparities exist. And we learn through this journey about learning about race and talking about it publicly, that the systems are doing exactly what they were designed to do. That when voting was for white landowners, that there was an intentional system, and the impact and the trauma created by that system in our history has impact on people of color. When Hawaiians were displaced from their land to become a state, there was a displacement of Native Hawaiian people, and being displaced from land created trauma, historical trauma, and the imbalance that we see in power in Hawaii amongst Native Hawaiian populations and the struggle to resettle on Hawaiian homelands. It's a part of that system. We're not blaming anybody for the system. We're simply saying we're at a point in time where we're looking to the past, we're looking at history, understanding what created those systems, and each trying to do a part to correct that. Is it going to work? Is the bank going to have wild success from it? We don't know, but they're trying. They're taking a step forward, putting the right foot forward. And it helps when all sectors join hands and do this work together. It mattered to have corporate leaders talking about AUW's ALICE report. It helped that everyone started to talk about ALICE, and then we can disaggregate data and say, hey, ALICE is working poor basically, but it's impacting every race and community in Hawaii, but it took all sectors to do that. So my point is just that we must work together. Yes, there are things that are going to work and not work. We're going to have to try a whole bunch of things, but just having this conversation, being real about what has happened to get us where we are, and being brave enough to have these discussions without beating one another up, but making sure that we're taking the right efforts to make the change that we're all looking for.
And what we're trying to do is create that critical mass that changes that power and access dynamic, right? I mean, it's even racism that isn't malevolent is power and access are sort of passed down from one generation to the next as a manifestation of a preference for people who make you feel comfortable, people who look like you know, go to the same school as you, went to the same church as you, that kind of thing. And what we need is to bring more people into the mix who have a diversity of experience and background and thought, so that, you know, you have more to choose from as you're attempting to do things like attract, retain, develop diverse talent, right? And to respond to one of the specific questions in the chat, it's not more work to review diverse candidates. Sometimes it's just more work to find diverse candidates, right? And that's what I mean to say. Is like, take the time, go that extra level deeper to figure out, okay, how can I increase the diversity of this group, create a different critical mass, whether that's, you know, thought, race, gender expression, sexual preference, neurodiversity, and it all works towards the same thing of breaking that monopoly that has, you know, heretofore run these institutions.
And I just want to take a time out we've been throwing around some acronyms. So I just want to share that with everyone. So when Michelle referred to COFA, that's Compact of Free Association, and that refers to Republic of Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau, the Republic of Palau, which we have, the US has a Compact of Free Association with. So that's the reference to COFA. And then we just talked about ALICE, and that's Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. So when we say working poor, it's the people working 2 jobs, and there was a ALICE report that was widely shared about the data with the number of people in Hawaii who meet this criteria and are just one paycheck away from being in catastrophic circumstances in terms of being able to keep their house or care for their children, et cetera. So there was a over the last few years, there was a very focused effort in terms of, we have some comments about how do we work collectively and collaboratively. That's one of the examples where there was a shared vision of what can we do in all of the areas that we have strengths in to try to begin to address that. So I just wanted to take a time out to define what those were for people. Dean Nelson, before we move to another question, do you have any comments on any of the discussion that we've been having today?
It's just one observation, and I'd love people's sense of this, but we have a willingness to iterate and to fail in other spaces of innovation and to think entrepreneurially about what that might mean to be in a certain sector. And it's sort of curious that when we start to talk about diversity and inclusion and equity and embrace of each other, we're reluctant to push too hard sometimes because there's such a fear of failure that can just leave us flat-footed and just where we were 10 years ago. And so I really think this is a space that we have to continue to sort of have a growth mindset, or whatever the proper way of thinking of it is like we know that what we cannot do is what we have been doing that has been consistently producing the exact same results. And we bemoan them and we hand wring and we're like, oh, and we have conversations, but we have to start acting. And, some things will be smashing successes. Some things will be marginal successes. Some things maybe we're like, we didn't do that well enough, but we have to be willing to be entrepreneurial and innovative in this space as well, in a multi-sector way. If 10 years from now, we're going to look back and say, yeah, we took some chances because we wanted to make things better, but we did see some quote unquote gains from that. And I think sometimes we're so fearful. We're fearful in our language. We're fearful in so many ways in this space that it binds us and prevents us from moving forward. So I think we do have to be somewhat more courageous and adopt the same sort of spiritedness that we do in other ways and other aspects of our lives and in our work, because this is work. This is not going to happen if we don't do anything differently, because it hasn't. And I think that's what the data bears out, to Michelle's point, right? So I think we have to be willing to take some risks in this space and to be perhaps bolder than we might naturally have been inclined to decades ago. But now we see as well, what we've been doing really hasn't borne as much fruit as one would have hoped. So time for courage, perhaps.
And part of that courage is, one, having the discussion, just having that. And then 2, I was just in a conversation similarly with others yesterday. And for example, someone had shared, but who's in charge of the effort on a big collective issue? And when we're talking about a system, we had to have a discussion about, we're conditioned to think someone has to be in charge, but when you're trying to impact the system, it's many entities and people taking individual accountability and actions toward a shared vision, and you don't see a lot happening. And then all of a sudden you hit the momentum, I think, Patrick, you were referring to, right, and creating the mass that everybody begins to see like, oh, it's shifting, and so to your point, Camille, talking about a growth mindset in terms of not economic growth and let's grow and grow and grow. A growth mindset is more the willingness to fail and learn from that and to fail fast and say, okay, that didn't work. What else can we do? As opposed to, oh, see, we should have never tried. And so it's a continuum of action, just like how we talked about the intersection of racism itself being a continuum of how sometimes I'm the brown person and sometimes people look at me and they say, well, you made the call, so you created this, right? So being able to understand that depending on the situation, we're on all sides of this issue and being accountable for that. Right.
But the other part I don't want us to lose, and I'll stop here, is when we are diversifying it as a verb spaces and trying to move forward with courage and empathy and love and nurturing and all the positive energy we can bring, we also have to think about how we then support the people who we bring in, who are come with us, right? And I think that's also a place where we have to be willing to do more, because when we start to experience the diversity that we are seeking and we are working towards achieving, things aren't the same, right, as they were before. And then I think that quakes people. And so I think we have to understand that we have to then listen to them. And that includes the youth, because they have a lot to say and we need to listen to them because this is their world that they're inheriting our crop, basically, right? So I think that's a really important thing. We have to then be thinking, how do we support the people who we are trying to embrace at the same time to make sure that they are then elevated and their voices carry even louder than ours.
And that it impacts the system, right? It's not just that we want to hit a statistic or a number to meet a diversity, but it's the reason why we're doing it, because more diversity leads to different policies, which leads to the adaptation, which causes the quakes in all of the systems, which is why system change is hard, right? Okay, getting back to the questions, we have Patrick. Did you want to answer any more about the direct questions that had been posed to you? I think you got most of them, but just in case, I know we cut you off a little bit.
Yeah, I think I hit most of them. I mean, look, it's from my own personal experience, we're trying to set something up here that works, right? So does it sound like jargon? Maybe it sounds like jargon to you, but it's a lot of hard work to me, right? And we're trying to set goals and try to achieve those goals. And at the end of the day, my boss sitting down the hall is going to ask me, whether we did, and if not, why not? And that's all very real to me, right? And I think if everybody approaches those issues in the same way and creating those systems of accountability within organizations like mine, then things do get done, because that which is measured gets done, right?
So we have 4 minutes left. I was going to put two questions together. One is a question about that says, we in many of our churches find that houses of worship also hold the privilege of creating safe spaces for this necessary conversation. While addressing our diversity and conversations, addressing the dismantling of oppressive structures and systems, we find that we also need help in creating a framework. How can we help and or partner with you all in community organizations, legal, education, and corporations to create spaces and opportunities? And then also adding to that, how can we create pipelines to ensure that the places of power that we've been referring to are reflective of community? So if each of our panelists could comment on that, that's the collaboration amongst cross-sector, amongst groups, and specifically with religious and community organizations who are already creating that space. And then second, in terms of what kinds of actions can be taken to help ensure that we also address the power by having people in those positions that reflect the community. Let's start with Justin.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question, and I, if I had a simple answer for it, I would offer that, but instead I will note that we have a lot of brilliant people in Hawaii. Some of them are on this panel tonight who have the power to make considerable change, to change institutions, to change the way education works, to change the way criminal justice is handled, to change the way that so many of the levers of power operate in Hawaii, and it falls to, I think, every one of us to push on those levers in whatever small way we can as individuals. So, I'm going to keep trying to do that from my vantage point, and just hope everyone else here, does the same.
Dr. Glenn?
Sure, I agree with Justin. This is a difficult question, and thinking about pipelines, something that I've been considering, we mentioned institutions when we talk about systemic racism. I think one of the things we have to be really real about is that some of the institutions as they exist are not for all of us. And there has to be space for new institutions to emerge. And some of those pipelines might be in those new institutions that are actually built with a diverse community in mind. And to the question about how we can collaborate, as I mentioned, we do teaching and learning and hosting cohorts across the community with our Understanding Race and Belonging framework that has been useful for some folks. We're happy to talk story with people who are interested in that. And we have worked with a number of faith communities who are interested in seeing how this aligns with their own values. So we're not the only ones who are having this conversation at the Popolo Project. There are many other brilliant people, as Justin noted, in Hawaii who are thinking about this really complex and multidimensional task ahead of all of us. So we're one place to start, but I think there are lots of people who are invested in this conversation too.
Michelle?
Yep, I'll just echo the group. I think that the Popolo Project's work is awesome and a great place to start in terms of curriculum. There are others, but I welcome our churches because those are safe spaces for families and communities. And so it could be a great place to have the conversation and just to encourage us to say, yes, we need that. We need these conversations to be happening in all spaces. And AO on creating new institutions where we can put those folks that are represented of all parts of our community. And there are ways that we at the Community Foundation can lean into those communities who are impacted the most to start informing the strategies around how we get resources to their respective communities, and we will do so. So thank you, Noi, for having me again.
Patrick?
I'll just say, collaboration is key, right? Collaboration across all sectors, and that in and of itself is an exercise in diversity that will make the effort stronger, right? That ability for all of us to trade thoughts and also trade and combine resources, right? Because I think that there are resources that I have that other people can use, and there are resources that other people have that I can use. And together, that sum is certainly greater than its parts, right?
Thank you. And Dean Nelson?
So pursuant to one of the questions, I mean, we work on the micro and the individual and the personal and the reflective self-awareness in service of the macro, right? So we're trying to do what we can with our own sphere of influence so we can work towards the greater good. And that takes humility, and that takes some vulnerability, right? And that takes a willingness, I think, to recognize that our work is inherently interdisciplinary. Certainly, I think mine is, and I think law generally is. Kemi will be joining us at orientation. Michelle, Patrick, Justin, I'll be reaching out. I think it's important for us to think about how we can partner. For me, the partnership is in service of our students, but in every sector, how do we work together towards some common goals that ultimately uplift and enhance this state and the reach of the people who are proud to call them this home, right? So it's gonna take a team.
Well, and thank you everyone. And addressing that, thank you for the audience member who put that in there. The target audience is everyone. And when we're talking about a system, it is micro and macro. And it is complexity. And I think the number one thing we wanted to get across is that we can talk about it and we should be talking about it. And that was the point of starting this series of discussions. So thank you to the panelists for sharing. Thank you to the audience for the questions. And we look forward to working with all of you. And thank you for letting us go over 3 minutes. Mahalo to everyone who has joined us.
Mahalo.